I have some cool insights. They're cool for me, okay? You'll probably go, what? Um, okay, so some of you subscribe to One for Israel, and you have heard their testimonies of Jews, for the most part, some Muslims, but typically Jews who have been raised Jewish, maybe not in a religious sense, but culturally for sure, and really not having much to do with Jesus, having a different concept of who Christ was and is, and then having their eyes opened. It's really cool. Highly recommend it. One for Israel, YouTube channel. They usually have a weekly podcast that's really good that's put out, and then just other things. But they offered a class to take, and it's finding Christ in the Old Testament, or the Messiah. More specifically, that finding the Messiah in the Old Testament, or in the Hebrew Bible. I signed up for the class. It's a master's class, and you can take it as a student with credit. It's just much more expensive and a lot harder. They require you to do certain things, or you could take the classes as just furthering your education. And I thought, I have got to take that class. So today was my first class. 3 hours. It's from 4 to 7 Israel, Jerusalem time. It's in English, which was great. And because I wouldn't have gotten one thing out of it if it was in Hebrew. But there's about 60 of us in the class, and it's the first 3 hours class today. So for our time, it was 7 a.m. to 10, which is great. Perfect timing for me. Really fascinating. I learned so much, and I'll probably try to touch on some of the things that we talked about. But basically today was an introduction, and we really talked a lot about a Jewish rabbi by the name of Rashi. And that's kind of his, not nickname, but the easiest way to pronounce his name, Rashi. He was French. He was a Jewish scholar, rabbi, born in 1040 and lived until 1105 AD. I know they probably call it something different than that now, but I'll just refer to AD. So this is right during the Crusade period. This is during the medieval times, and to understand his perspective. So what his purposes was basically to convince Jews not to convert to Christianity, to defend Jews against Christianity, which at that time was the Catholic Church, and refute anything to do with Christ in the Old Testament, what we would call the Old Testament, or the Torah, the law, which is more of the oral law, which includes more than just the 5 books of Moses. But in any event, I don't know what that even means, but Rashi was a genius, and his arguments were amazing. Scriptures that we would just say, this absolutely has to do with Christ, and we're right. He would take those and say, no, this is different. So just the quickest, easiest one is if you look at Isaiah 53, which a lot of Jews don't even like to talk about, the Orthodox. But if you go to Isaiah 53, we all just go, wow, how could you deny, that this isn't talking about Christ? For he shall grow up, this is verse 2, before him as a tender plant and as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness. That actually means that he's not attractive. And when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Now, we just go check, check, check. Jesus, 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 right? But what Rashi did, being his main objective, was to simplistically teach the Jews to not convert to Christianity and to refute anything to do with Christ in the Hebrew Bible. What he said this meant was the Israel as a people, as a country. So for he, Israel, grew up before him as a tender plant and as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form, no comeliness. And when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. Talking about the children of Israel. And you know what? In my opinion, he's not wrong about that, Rashi, because you cannot separate Christ from Israel. You can't. They go along with each other. So it's really fascinating to get into the head. Now, just a little bit of background on Rashi. So he's from France. So during the Crusades, this is where replacement theology originated. It was replacing that the Jews had disqualified themselves, and you got to go back to Rehoboam and Jeroboam, really, because Rehoboam, southern kingdom. This is after Solomon. Jeroboam, the northern kingdom. But basically it was the kingdom of Judah and then all the rest. So sometimes, even in the Book of Mormon, Nephi, they refer to themselves as Jews, even though they're the tribe of Manasseh. But many of those northern tribes escaped to Jerusalem when the 10 tribes were scattered and taken over, right? So by Assyria. So when we talk of Judah, basically it's who remained in the southern kingdom. The rest were. So anyway, kind of a side note there, but so during the Crusades, the Jews were looked upon as basically that they needed to be eliminated, and that the Christians, the Catholic Church, I'll just say it, were going to replace them. And so the crusade was to take the pilgrims' safe passage and take over and conquer Jerusalem and Israel and replace the Jews as God's people. Well, the Crusaders and those like-minded individuals were like, well, we don't need to go all the way to Israel to wipe out Jews. We have a lot of Jews right here. And Rhineland is like Germany and that area at that time. I think it was called Rhineland, is my memory of my class. This is all from the class, right? Today. They systematically just started wiping out the Jews in the name of Christianity. So you can see where Rashi would be coming from. It gives you compassion on him, because his view of Christianity was what he was experiencing. And so when we can see where he's coming from and see where his thoughts are, because basically he's the authority. Modern day Orthodox Jews go to Rashi to defend their argument that Jesus is not the Messiah. Yeah. And his arguments are pretty cool, because once we get into the head of Rashi and we can actually defend his argument, then we can know how to actually talk to somebody of the Jewish faith, because we know that argument or that theory or that line of thinking, and then we can through the Spirit refute that, change their mind. But unless we understand where they're coming from, it won't work. We can't use the New Testament to prove it, that Jesus is the Christ, to a Jew who believes in the Torah and who believes in Rashi's interpretation of that. Okay, so that's just one little thing. So we talked about Isaiah 53. One of the other messianic scriptures, probably the first one that we come to, is in Genesis chapter 3. And this is an insight that I just had during this class. I've had portions of this and I've shared it over the, gosh, it's almost been 2 years I've been doing these videos. I think it's 2 years in December. Crazy. It was pre-COVID is when I started these. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Now we have this version, we have the one in Moses, slightly different, not much. And then we have the temple version. Verse 15, Genesis 3:15. This is now remember, Messianic Jews look to this as a prophecy of Christ. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Now we get a lot of tradition from those two verses. A lot of tradition. The thing that the members of this class don't have is what we learn in the temple about this particular thing. Now I'll be careful. Don't want to talk about sacred things in this setting, but think about it. Those of you that have received your endowment and have since gone and been taught and studied in the temple, you'll find out certain things about this particular scripture and the changes in there. But one of the things that the Messianic Jews believe that this points to Christ is that Christ will have power to bruise the head, which is more lethal than bruising your heel, which is what Satan can do. That's the interpretation. And I think we all feel pretty comfortable about that. Where Rashi said, he goes, no, this doesn't have anything to do with that. This is simply a snake, and they're equal in power, because a snake can bite your heel and the venom will kill you just as easy as bruising your head or hurting your head, attacking the head. And he goes, a snake's on the ground, a serpent's on the ground. The power is equal. And all it means is, this is according to rabbinic philosophy originating from Rashi, is that these are just equal powers, and it's man can kill an animal and an animal can kill a man. That's the end of the story. It has nothing to do with Jesus or anything else. Well, we learn in the temple it's way different, right? Now, here's the thought that I've had, and just a continuation of that thought. But the thought I've had for quite some time is that this really isn't talking about Eve, the woman. It's talking about Mary, because the seed of the woman, or that will have power to, I'm not going to say the word, but think of the word in the temple versus what we say in the scripture. So the bruise, the head, is Christ bruising the head, of Satan or the serpent. Okay? And it's just so perfectly done in the temple. So if Christ is the seed, who's the woman? Well, in my opinion, Eve could be a metaphor, but the real deep meaning of this is Mary. Her seed is Jesus Christ. And after he is born and conquers death in victory, he bruises the head. Okay? And he conquers. Death and hell. So then, unto the woman, this is verse 16, Genesis 3:16, unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow. The woman, think of Mary, and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. I know it says children, but just think of this. And thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Now, for as long as I can remember, it was been taught that, there's got to be a head to a household and the priesthood. And eventually the decision has to come to the man. And this is the basis of that scripture right there. And I know there's other scriptures. Paul talks about some things, but think of this. If this is speaking of Christ, and Christ's mother is Mary, and he shall rule over thee, thy husband. Well, in one sense, who's Mary's husband? Who's the father of Jesus? And he shall rule over thee. Elohim. So in a marriage with individuals, in the sealing, it's always a covenant with God. Eve doesn't make a covenant with Adam. Eve makes a covenant with God. And so, who shall rule over thee? Your husband, Mary. This scripture is so messianic, so pointing to the birth of Christ. It's just awesome. But it also speaks of relationships. So a husband and wife, who shall rule over them? God. I don't see it any other way. We've had this idea, and it's been taught for a long time, and the temple is teaching us a different way, that we only answer to God. We make a covenant with God. We don't make covenant with men. We don't make covenants with men. Eve never made a covenant with man. She made a covenant with God. So those are just some insights that I've had from this class, and just a kind of a continuation of the garden. So basically, you have to go to the birth of Christ to understand the garden. You have to go to Christ to understand the relationship of Adam and Eve. You have to go to the birth of Christ and Mary and his life to understand a husband-wife relationship. You really do. I'm so excited for this class. I'm going to continue. It's once a week, every Wednesday morning. It's a 3-hour class, and it goes till mid-December. And I get no credit, and I'm glad because I let my mind just go, and I don't have to put out papers and do stuff because I don't have that kind of mind, a scholastic mind, but and mine's not the purpose of getting a degree or anything. It's just to help me understand more about the covenant of Israel and about the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible, and not just the Messiah, but that the Messiah is Jesus Christ. So anyway, I hope that I explained my insight on that. I hope that's helpful. The other thing I wanted to mention, totally changing the subject, but I just want you to consider some questions here. It has to do with prophets. So a couple of videos ago, I did one on Saul, David, Solomon, right? And temples. And I talked a little bit about that. And I've been, for some reason, this has been on my mind. I've been studying that in the Old Testament, the time of the kings, right? And that's why it's Rehoboam and Jeroboam are fresh on my mind, because they came, that's when the kingdom was divided. But the interesting thing about that is the relationship of prophets to kings at the time. I think sometimes we think a prophet is a prophet is a prophet, and they all have the same role and they all do the same thing. And it's interesting because Saul, David, and Solomon all had a part to play in building the temple. Now, Solomon was the ultimate benefactor, I guess you could say. He's the one that reaped the blessings of God allowing him to build the temple. But he wasn't a prophet. He was a king. David was not a prophet. He was a king. Now, Samuel was the prophet during a lot of that time. What relationship did that prophet have to the king? And what did the king have to do to get a temple built? And then, so just think about that. Most of the kings in the northern kingdom ended up being really wicked. And there were different prophets sent to tell the kings what they were doing wrong. In the southern kingdom, there were, in Judah, they had some good kings, mostly bad, but they had some good kings. But they had prophets in the southern kingdom that were telling them. So you see, there's a different role for those prophets. They didn't necessarily, like you would think a prophet would be in charge of building the temple, but they weren't. The kings were. Isn't that interesting? Priesthood, I don't know. Anointed by prophets sometimes. Anointed to be a king, but the prophets weren't involved in building the temple. You could say that with Solomon. You could say it with when King Cyrus of Persia allowed the Jews to come back and help finance and help rebuild the temple. Right? Not a prophet. King Herod, are you kidding me? Not a prophet. Build the temple, or reestablished. We call it the Second Temple, and the huge complex that was with that. But there were prophets at the time. And then you look at it this way. I'll ask this question too. We say Lehi was a prophet. Samuel the Lamanite, a prophet. Nephi, a prophet. Were they prophets in the sense that we think of a prophet today? Just ask that question. I think we do ourselves a disservice by just lumping prophets, just say prophets, and they all have the same thing. Because we know that Jeremiah was a contemporary of Lehi. Did one have more authority over the other? Were they both chosen by God? Lehi's prophecy to him, being a prophet, was pretty exclusive to his family, and a few, a little bit broader, but not much. But we look at him as a prophet, and Nephi as a prophet. Did Nephi have the same type of authority? Now, if you go back, before the kings, you had judges, you had prophets. Before judges, you had Joshua and Moses. Okay? Now, Moses was in a sense both a king and a prophet. Joshua, king and a prophet. He ruled the people, but he also received revelation and was prophetic and was the mouthpiece for God, for the people. But he was also the ruler. I'm wondering if we haven't gone full circle, and that's where we are now. Our prophet is both our president, we could say king, and our prophet. And perhaps, I'm just thinking out loud here, perhaps that is preparing us for the prophet and the king. Our prophet, our priest, our king, where it'll be one individual. So Moses was a type of Christ in a sense. He gathered scattered Israel. He rescued them from bondage, led them away from bondage, delivered the covenant. He's a type, right? A type. Maybe Joseph Smith was that type where it's come full circle. So prophet has a different, he's both the king or president and the prophet. So maybe we're getting ready. And this type of relationship of a prophet and a king, or prophet and a president being one and the same, is preparing us for the ultimate prophet and the ultimate king, even Jesus Christ. Something to consider. I love you all. Thanks for listening. I will give you updates as I learn more and study more. I have a lot of things to study in preparation for next week's class. I've been given a lot of reading material. So as I go through this, I'll share what insights I can, what I can remember up here. Anyway, I think that's it. You guys have a blessed day. I love you all. Bye-bye.